From a cameraman standpoint, he was God's given gift.
I've always felt with Frank that I grew as an artist on each film.
Frank was at the peak of his game. He in this material brought to life a picture, as I say, that was better than our wildest dreams.
It is one of the few movies that has directly, as a result, influenced American history.
Frank took on a film project much as Patton would take on a battle. He was very organized, he was very direct, he had his own unique style. I got very close to Frank and Frank's work because we gave him Planet of the Apes at that time, and he convinced me with that work that he was a man that could do something very special. He had a great vision, and he had great passion for this character of Patton, and he wasn't the obvious choice at the time to do it, but I was convinced that he would add scope as well as significance to this project.
It is marvelous to watch the individual from time to time. I found the whole fact of history being recorded through Patton's eyes enormously stimulating. It was history that all of us had lived through, and history about which we did not know enough. But this kind of retelling of an historical event or a historical character, particularly when the character is as controversial, as infamous as Patton was, fascinates me a great deal.
The color that the historical character brought to this subject was enough to carry any film. I mean, he was charismatic, he was controversial, he was bizarre, and he was a great leader, and he was real.
We set out to do a character study in some depth. We did not set out to present an argument. Now, it happens that Patton obviously was a general, that his background was war, but he is such an enormously controversial, complex, bizarre, provocative, thrusting character, you know, that you could transfer this kind of personality against a background, say, of publishing, against a political background, against an economic background. Almost any background would have done for this kind of character. You know, my interest has always been looking at guys who are out of place in their time. And I do believe that Patton was out of place in his time, with the exception of this 2 3/4 year period. It is fascinating that guys like him, and I am not one of them, have this fanatical drive to achieve what they believe on a realistic level and indeed on a mystical level they are cut out to achieve. It is also terribly fascinating to study the fact that this kind of giant that emerges inevitably has feet of clay, and that is what does him in.
This was actually Frank McCarthy's passion. Frank McCarthy was a retired general, and he had always wanted to make this story and had hounded various studios, and in particular 20th Century Fox with my father and myself for years. He was a meticulous producer, very careful. When I met him as a cub producer, he was at 20th Century Fox. He was in charge of the ratings of certain pictures. He would be the guy that you would go with a picture or a script to the ratings board and get the various ratings. And he worked in that capacity for many years. He was very much of the diplomat.
General Patton was always successful in battle. He never lost a foot of ground at any time in his career. He enjoyed the most spectacular and dazzling victories, always lots of razzle-dazzle about him. But in between, when he was not fighting, he was always in trouble, so that his curve, instead of going steadily upward like the others, looks like an electrocardiogram. It's up and down, and that, of course, makes for good drama.
This was, about one guy, and I think that's what made it great, because once we hit with an audience that emotional connection, that emotional desire that audiences said, well, these are the kind of guys that we depended upon when the going got tough. Might not like them as civilians, but when it was on the line, those are the guys you wanted leading the charge. And I think people yearned for that. I think they still do yearn for that kind of leadership and that kind of strength of character when times are tough.
We are not defending General Patton, and we are not attacking General Patton. We are really telling the true story of one of the most fabulous and interesting characters that I have ever observed in action. The war and the excitement of it and the beauty of some of the locales that we've chosen in Spain and so on all constitute the tapestry against which we tell the story of a flamboyant man, and particularly of his relationship with General Bradley, because these two men were opposites. Patton was the flamboyant, and Bradley was the quiet, calm, cool soldier. As you probably know, when they started out in North Africa, Bradley was General Patton's deputy. But because of the slapping episode and various other things that happened, General Patton was put on ice for a little while. And while he was on ice, General Bradley rose above him in command so that when they went into Europe, the commands had been reversed. Now Patton was working for Bradley. This is an intensely interesting story, what went on between these two men. And of course, we are fortunate to have had the services of General Bradley as senior military consultant on the picture so that we know we're telling things as they really happen. I thought it would be a good idea to get a writer who was not involved in World War II at all, somebody who would have a completely objective view of General Patton. So I called Francis Coppola, who was just beginning to get recognition. I said, have you had any military experience? And he said, yes. He said, I was in the band at the New York Military Academy for 2 months before I deserted. So I said, you're just the man we want. He wrote a very imaginative script. He really wrote a wonderful script. We went through it together. We had history lessons every day.
The Coppola version was very flashy and had all of the great sequences, all of the great one-liners and great quotes and all of those brilliant moments, but it didn't quite all come together. Eddie North was one of those guys that was a very solid, bright guy that if you had a problem, he could fix it. He brought all of this real wonderful material together into a script with 3 acts, and he really made it work. We came up with, I think, one of the best scripts I've ever been associated with.
We were, I think, terribly lucky in the casting of this picture. They always say that a director's job is solved by 90% when the script is right, and he is cast correctly, and I think that's probably true. You know, there are a dozen different people you could dream of to put into these parts, but you would get out what you put in. You would get a screen image out. And in this instance, Scott, I think, particularly is as brilliance coming off that screen, which is unlike, I think, any performance in motion pictures. I'll go out on a limb in the last 15 years.
I don't know of a single other American actor who could have played this part. George Scott, precisely right for it. The grace and the humor, all of these combinations, made him absolutely perfect casting for it.
Karl is just a sweetheart. Karl is not only a great actor, one of the most believable, natural actors I've ever seen on the screen. But he just stepped right into that role. You believed him as a general. He was a great foil, in a way, for this live wire character, Patton. He was the voice of reason. He was the steady hand.
He is very superior in a very, very difficult part. It is one thing to play the flamboyant, amusing, angry character. It's quite another thing to play the level-headed, dull character and make it a legitimate contrast, make it a motivating character. And this is what, obviously, Karl Malden does with enormous skill. And interestingly enough, without any kind of makeup at all, I look at Karl Malden and I say, my God, it is Bradley. He doesn't look a thing like him. But it manages to suggest Bradley. And certainly, George, with his makeup, looks like Patton.
George Scott and Karl Malden were not big, huge movie stars at the time. It was a risk. World War II was a risk. But what we believed in and what really paid off was that belief that this character is so unique that people will be moved by him. They may not agree with him, but he's unique. There wasn't anybody like George Patton.
My first impression of Franklin was, here is the epitome of a gentleman. I mean, it's just the way he comes over. I actually thought he was English. He just had an air about him that was the perfect gentleman. He gave you the time, and he wanted you to have the time to go over the script with him personally. And we would sit down, and particularly after we had seen some of the locations, so you kind of knew what you were talking about, we would sit down and go through the script page by page. On Franklin's pictures, by the time you were starting to shoot that picture, the communication was minimal between us because we knew. We had already talked about it. And of course, you finalized and talked about things. But this was a great feeling working with him.
If I make pictures for the next 20 years of my life, I will never make another picture, I am convinced, with as many locations in it. It's simply, I don't think, the picture will be written. The next time a picture with that many locations turns up in a production office, they say you're crazy, and they'll throw you out because it was insanity to have had, apparently so many locations. 72. Now that means physical moves. There were 72 exterior, interior, natural locations for roughly 74 pages of script, which means that you're moving to a location every page. And anybody who is familiar at all with the business knows what an enormous logistical bit that is just by itself. Forget tanks, forget troops, forget the hardware, forget everything else. Move the company. The whole problem of how do you transport this enormous, this enormous army, not in uniform, the picture makers, how you feed them, how you house them when you get into an area like Segovia, a small town, where there is only one hotel, one decent hotel.
I don't think this picture could have been made unless it had been shot in Spain, because the Spanish Army has all the Second World War hardware, the tanks, the half-tracks, the self-propelled vehicles, guns, etc. And they have them because the United States of America traded these vehicles to them in exchange for air bases. They also happen to have an army which is for rent upon demand to motion picture projects. And as a matter of fact, there is a very interesting gentleman who occupies a position on the general staff of the Spanish Army whose responsibility is liaison with motion picture companies.
From a standpoint of production, it was probably the biggest picture I worked on, because I used to kid about it when we would leave to go on location. I said, it looks like the circus is coming to town because of so many trucks and so much equipment. And it's an amazing thing to me on that picture, with all of the logistics of that picture, we never lost any time on that picture for any reason. Every day was a production day. The Spanish crew was terrific. I mean, these guys just worked their tails off for us. They were great. If you needed something, you can bet you'd have it. And I remember saying we needed to build something, and it was there the next morning, No, they really did work hard for us. But like the assistant director in Spain has far more authority in some ways than an assistant director here in the States does. Like extras and people like that are really almost afraid of the assistant director because he is God on the set. Frank and I talked about weather because we knew there was going to be that time of year, because this was January, we're going to start shooting in February, and we shot till June. We would go through all kinds of weather. And of course, we needed bad weather for a lot of it, but still, Frank said to me, he said, let's just keep shooting. If it rains, it rains. If a cloud comes over, a cloud comes over.
We would be shooting in snow one day, and then snow would melt the next, and we would run back into Madrid and shoot in cover sets. And about 4 o'clock, somebody would say, pack your underwear when you come tomorrow, fellas, your long underwear. They say there's snow there. And lo and behold, there is snow, and you run up, and it snows so hard that you cannot make a single shot because it's nothing but snow coming down. Now, we had no protection against weather. If it rained, we were out. And it did rain. In Almeria, where it's not supposed to rain. The natives will tell you it hasn't rained in 25 years. It's a lot of baloney.
It rained when the Patton Company got there. We ran into one or two instances where, in the bitter cold and the rain up in Segovia, where we were working one day, and we had headed up that hill at about 8:30 in the morning in just intolerable conditions. It was just, and we were shooting with open cameras and small sound unit and that kind of thing, only because we simply couldn't get the equipment up there. Well, we had the tanks and the Spanish Army on a kind of a one-way road, and everybody was wet and cold. It was impossible to get food up that road. And we had simply arbitrarily faced the fact ourselves that we weren't going to eat that day. We'd just keep on shooting until we were finished. But the Spanish Army didn't quite feel that way. And about 2:30 in the afternoon, when I still had 2 shots to make in the sequence, the sergeant in charge decided that they had had enough, that they were hungry and that they were cold. At 3 o'clock, he said goodbye, and his stuff started moving down the hill, and we set up the cameras. And we started setting off explosions and so on and so forth, and they were running through this, and we just grabbed that stuff as they were running to lunch.
For some of the big battle scenes, we always combined the 2 units, because that way we had 6 cameras shooting. And again, we would, particularly that one big battle scene down there in the desert. I mean, there's a scene that, yes, you were impressed just to be there, because we were up on this hill looking down this valley in this pass, and the American tanks were lined up on the hills, camouflaged on both sides, and they knew the Germans were coming down through that pass. When we said roll, or they started to roll, you couldn't see anything, but you could hear all these engines and the troops, and it was mind-boggling. I mean, you just, what's going to happen? And they came down, and they came around the hill and started coming down through that valley, and those engines and those tread noise that they were making, I mean, it was really exciting.
We restaged a battle called the Battle of El Guitar, which involved, I think, 60 German tanks coming down the pike and about 17 to 2,200 German infantry. And I had gone on for days, or at least 6 weeks, laying out the choreography of this particular attack, which involved, as Rommel did, for some strange reason, always sent infantry in first. The infantry made contact with the enemy, and then the tanks were sent up in support, which is exactly the opposite of what an American general would have done. And I had laid it out in this context. The day before we're to shoot this massive battle, Paul Harkins comes to me with an obscure piece of research and says, "I'm sorry to tell you, buddy," he said, "the infantry did not come down first. They came down with tanks in box formation with the infantry intermingled with the tanks." Well, there was nothing for me to do but choreograph this whole thing.
I believe that Dimension 150 was only used on 2 pictures, the first being the Bible, and then we used it again on Patton. You know, in those days, we did what was called roadshow. People would book seats in advance, so anything to give your piece of entertainment added significance was used in marketing, and that was one of the things. Plus, that picture probably looked as good as any picture I've ever been associated with.
These were flat lenses. These were not anamorphic lenses. And they got their name, Dimension 150, because they had one lens that was actually 150 degrees of picture. Now, that's a lot of screen. Unfortunately, when we started the picture, we didn't have all the equipment. All the lenses were not available yet. We had no zoom. We had the 150, and I think we had maybe like a 2-inch or something that we used for close-ups. But as the picture progressed and we started shooting, more equipment became available, and we actually ended up with 6 shooting cameras and lenses for all the cameras. The advantage of this is you put this on a big screen and it's just beautiful. You know, it's one big negative, and it's not anamorphic. It's not being spread out or brought in. It's a good, clean, terrific definition. So it's exciting to work with, and to go see your dailies on it. there's not a process shot, there's not a blue screen shot, there's no cheating type shots in the picture. Everything in that picture was shot for real, which I think is really interesting. But with a hand camera, I could climb on a tank, I could walk with a tank, or if we did any kind of a little fight sequence, you could move around real quickly with it. So that's a tremendous advantage of a hand camera on a fight scene, is an operator on it is not confined to a dolly or a shot or a place. He can move it to where he wants. We didn't have any test time on the picture at all. We never saw that. I don't remember. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not true. We did shoot some tests. Just remembered. We went out and the Spanish army was doing some maneuvers and right outside of Madrid, and they were using a lot of tanks. So I asked Frank if I could go out and just shoot some stuff to look at and get some ideas how it would look. And of course he was all for it. So we did. We went out and shot day and night stuff. And with all these, they were actually firing the tanks and doing explosions for their maneuvers. And so I just put the camera up and let it roll through all of this. And it was really interesting effects, really was. And doing little things like that, you get to know your lenses and what they can do. But because of the tremendously wide screen on that one big lens, you had to think about composition and where you wanted things and where the people are. And that's, where Frank would work with me and I'd work with Frank.
I can only say that my relationship with General Patton is one that has not and will not end with simply making a moving picture about him. It's one of admiration for a great individualist. As to glorifying him, I don't think that's what we set out to do. I certainly didn't set out to make any kind of glorification of war, of which I disapprove. My sole interest in this picture was to illuminate one man who made a very great impression on his time and who possibly will make an even greater impression in generations to come. It was an enormous logistical problem for us to move tanks and weapons and personnel of the Spanish army about, but of course the difficulty that I encountered was one, I would say, of in the nature of characterization and working on the script, as one does when you try to take it off the page and make it as real an entity as possible. I knew it was impossible for me to look precisely like General Patton and didn't really think that was terribly important. The idea is to give a general impression of the man rather than to mimic him. That seems to have been the work we did there with the shaving of the head and wearing an excellent white half-bald piece. The work we did with my somewhat battered nose to try to straighten it and make it a little more patrician. General Patton was a gentleman and had a finely drawn, finely chiseled face. All of these things seem to have been reasonably successful, and they're, of course, an enormous help in setting about the other considerations, the psychological considerations and the technical considerations of acting a part.
George was having some difficulties during the production. He had bad eye problem. I think that the pain that he was in probably had something to do with the fact that he drank more than he should have. And he's a guy who's very bright and a guy that thinks a lot about what he is doing and wants to make it perfect. And I think he's a guy that's very short on patience. And there were a few eruptions.
The very first day of shooting, we went out on a set. George showed up at lunch. And we all broke for lunch, went to lunch, and somewheres around 2 o'clock, we started shooting that day's work. And by 5 o'clock, we had finished that day's work. What happened with George is he's so intent, and he got himself so built up the night before starting this thing, and the character, I suppose, that he just couldn't get out to the set. But the point I want to make is that when he did come, he was so prepared and so good that we didn't lose a minute. The day went right on normal, and that impressed me immensely, that first day of shooting.
The opening of the picture, with George standing in front of the flag, was really an afterthought. It was originally conceived as the beginning of the second act after the intermission. When both Franks, Frank McCarthy and Frank Schaffner, came to me a few days before they were going to shoot it and explained that they thought that this would be a great way to introduce the character, I was sold on it, but George didn't like it at all. George's feeling was that he could never recover as a character with that kind of bizarre opening. I mean, that it set the character before he even had a chance to open his mouth. I think that the way that Frank Schaffner shot it was brilliant because it told you everything you needed to know, not in a cartoon style, about that man, so that you were prepared as an audience for the rest of the film and for this kind of behavior.
He knew those lines, and he could just rattle them off. And he didn't want to do it again, unless Frank wanted it again for a reason. George is the kind of guy, if he does it right and he feels it, that's it. And we shot that master scene, and we moved in, and then we did a lot of little intricate shots of, his gun and his ribbons and, everything about him. And we were done by the middle of the afternoon. It didn't even take a full day.
Franklin Schaffner, I read somewhere the other day that someone called him that most civil of directors. He is a civil man and a gentleman and a man of enormous energies. Quiet, very forceful, very hardworking. And it's highly unlikely that I would have been able at all to complete the work on the film without this man.
I think he was very good with actors. I think they respected him. Frank couldn't be shaken. He couldn't be moved off a certain path. I mean, that doesn't mean that he was stubborn, but he was very direct and very focused. He knew what he wanted, and he did it and got it. And I think he was one of the great, great directors.
At the time of Patton, I was under contract to 20th Century Fox. And after having done Planet of the Apes, I was naturally assigned to do the sequel of Planet of the Apes. Unfortunately, the sequel was being done exactly the same time as Patton. And Frank came back from Europe after shooting Patton and said, "You're going to do Patton?" I said, "I am." I said, "When's it go?" And he told me, so "I'm doing Planet of the Apes, the second one." I said, "You're what?" So "I'm doing the sequel." He said, "No, you're not. You're going to do Patton." I said, "It's not up to me." So this sort of torture went on for a couple of months until finally Dick Zanuck, who was running the studio, was head of the studio then, stepped in and said that I was going to do Patton. And thank God. I mean, if I look back in history and think that I didn't do Patton because I was doing a sequel to Planet of the Apes, I don't know what I would do. I've found over the years that when a director says to me that I play a musical instrument, that I'm musical, I said, that's trouble. Frank didn't play a musical instrument, but he loved music, and he understood what music should do in a film and what it should be in a film. And we had a very funny running gag. When I did the original main title on Planet of the Apes, I had a piccolo doing his little figure, which made it a little bit too playful. And Frank said, "It's a little too playful. Maybe you should put it on the flutes." And I said, "Good idea, you're right." And from that point on, he would always chide me by saying, I hate piccolos. So I remember he looked at the music once on Patton, on some of the sketches I was writing on Patton. He said, "What's this piccolo?" I said, "That's a piccolo trumpet. I don't want any piccolos." Piccolo trumpet being this very small B-flat trumpet. Stylistically, it's me, the music in Patton. I wanted to treat Patton as a three-tiered personality, as a character, because he was a complex person and multi-layered. And I wanted to, naturally, the warrior, which would be treated with the march, and then the religious aspect of him, which was with a chorale, and then the fanfare, which was his reflection, which was supposed to be the archaic, his belief in reincarnation. And I wanted those three themes to work in concert with each other, as counterpoint to one another. That they would stand on them by themselves. Two could play, three could play. They could all work together. I didn't consciously set about doing anything for the archaic. I knew I had to do it, and I was, all of a sudden one day I just wrote this down. I said, oh, that works great for that, the past. So what I did is I wanted to be repeated and get softer and softer and softer. So we had a very primitive echo device then, electronic device. So all the trumpet player would play is da-dum, and then it would repeat over and over again. It was just tape delay echo, what it wasn't. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, decayed away. And for some reason, this became so catchy to everybody. I mean, it's amazing how that little simple little device became. All of a sudden, everybody got very excited about that. And that's the way to do it, with electronically. Well, I do this, I do it in concert all the time. I do Patton. I end my programs all the time with Patton and with that fanfare, which they play live. They play it just as easily. It's just the same. It's interesting. In a film that's almost 3 hours long, there's only 32 minutes, roughly 32 minutes of score in the picture, as opposed to, if that picture was made today, it'd probably be an hour and 30 minutes of music at least in the picture.
Hollywood has a terrible record on making war pictures. We were obviously in a just war, and Hollywood has always attached a very romantic, unreal view to the Second World War.
What was very clear to us was that Richard Nixon, believe it or not, was very influenced by Patton. He saw the movie more than once, at least twice, perhaps more. He was very stunned by the movie, and it is one of the few movies, much more so even than JFK, that has directly, as a result, influenced American history. Because I believe that it was Patton in April of 1970 that made Nixon make that final decision to cast the die in Cambodia and invade Cambodia, to expand the Vietnam War. That invasion, successful or not, most people think it was unsuccessful militarily, led ultimately to the vast American bombing of Cambodia and to the resurgence of the Khmer Rouge rebels who took over Cambodia, very much anti-American because of the bombing, and as a result slaughtered, 2-3 million Cambodian people. So there is no instance in which a movie like this has led directly to genocide, but I would say that Patton did. When we set out to make Nixon, we needed permission from 20th Century Fox to clear the Patton clips for use in our movie. I had a scene I'd written where Nixon and his family, Patton, Trish, are watching the movie in the projection room at the Oval Office. And Nixon's a little loaded, and he's digging the movie, and his wife is falling asleep because she's seen it more than once, and she can't stand it anymore. So, but his daughter, who was a hawk, was pushing him as a result of the movie to push into Cambodia. Anyway, that scene was approved by Fox, and they told us we had to go to George C. Scott to get permission for the clip also. And unfortunately, Scott said no way, didn't even consider any letter or, wouldn't talk about it, just a blank no. And I never understood the reason. Perhaps Scott, in some way, may have been bothered by what he knows to be the truth, that his movie contributed to Cambodia.
I remember I got a letter from, I guess it was Mrs. Patton, who said that her grandson, who was now in, sister, who was in West Point, or VMI, I don't know which one of the, would serenade his girls with the soundtrack to Patton. I said, oh, that's interesting. And it was, I've seen various people react in various different ways to that music and to the film. And the music has been actually, was used in two very interesting places. It was when they in Desert Storm, when they went in, the troops went in, they used Patton, the music, the march from Patton. And also when the Marines were trying to get Noriega out of hiding, they stopped bombarding him with rock and roll, and they played Patton. He came out